I died in the spring of 1991, in the hollow where the mud never freezes, sitting on the flat rock beside the upper spring with a trowel in my hand and a row of freshly planted ginseng seedlings at my feet. My great-niece Alma found me an hour later when she came up the path with a jar of coffee and a question about when to divide the ramps. She said I looked like I'd just stopped to rest between rows. Maybe I had. I'd been planting things in warm ground for 56 years by then, and my hands knew the work better than my mind did. So it's possible the last thing I did on this earth was tuck a root into soil that would keep it alive through any winter. That seems right. That seems like the ending Asa would have wanted for this place. It started in a room that smelled like floor wax and old paper. The county clerk's office in Marshall, North Carolina, on the second Tuesday of March, 1935. I was standing against the back wall because there weren't enough chairs and nobody offered me one. The clerk, a man named Boyd Ramsey, who wore suspenders over a shirt that had been white before it was washed too many times, read Asa Pennington's will aloud in a voice that suggested he'd rather be somewhere else. Asa had no wife, no children, no close relatives who wanted anything to do with him. What he had was 42 acres on the north side of Laurel Ridge, a one-room cabin, and what Boyd called a parcel of bottomland characterized by seasonal flooding and limited agricultural value. My cousin Irene, who had driven up from Asheville in a hat she couldn't afford, leaned over to the woman beside her and whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "A mud hole and some roots." That's what he left that girl, a mud hole and some roots. The room rippled. Boyd looked up, looked at me, and looked back down. I folded my hands. I was 18 years old, and I had learned two things at the Laurel Creek Home for Girls: how to keep my face still when people were laughing, and how to read a room that didn't want me in it. My parents died in the same week, in November of 1923. My father first, a logging accident on a crew working the ridgeline above Hot Springs. A cable snapped. They told my mother it was quick. My mother followed 6 days later. The doctor at the time called it pneumonia, but the women in the valley called it what it was. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and stopped wanting to be in a world that had her husband's work boots by the door and nobody to fill them. I was 6. I had a brother, James, who was 8. James went to live with a cousin in Buncombe County. I went to Laurel Creek because the cousin had room for one child, and a boy was more useful on a farm than a girl. That was the logic. That was always the logic. Usefulness measured in what you could lift, not what you could think. At Laurel Creek, the matron was a woman named Mrs. Husk, who believed that girls should learn 3 things: cooking, sewing, and silence. I learned the first 2. The third I never managed. I read everything I could find: the almanacs in the supply closet, the seed catalogs that came addressed to the previous matron, a water-damaged copy of Gray's Manual of Botany that someone had donated thinking it was a Bible. I asked questions about soil. I asked questions about why certain plants grew where others didn't. I dug up a section of the orphanage yard to test whether wood ash changed the color of hydrangeas. It did. Mrs. Husk made me fill the hole back in and told me that curiosity in a girl was like a crack in a jug. It let everything useful leak out. I thought about that for a long time and decided she was wrong. The crack is where the light gets in. But I didn't say that to Mrs. Husk. Some arguments you save for later when you have a piece of land and no one watching. If you want to find out what Asa Pennington buried in that mud hole and why 3 towns would come to depend on it when the frost killed everything else, subscribe to Hollow and Harvest and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what I found when I finally dug past the mud and into the warm ground beneath it is a story that proved every person in that clerk's office wrong. The ride from Marshall took 40 minutes on a road that stopped being a road about halfway through. The mail carrier, a man named Otis Deal, who drove a truck that coughed blue smoke and had a door held shut with baling wire, took me as far as the creek crossing below Laurel Ridge and pointed up the hollow. Asa's place is up that way. Follow the mud. When the mud gets warm, you're close. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. I carried everything I owned in a flour sack, 2 dresses, a comb, a bar of soap, the copy of Gray's manual, and the deed to 42 acres that my cousin Irene had called a mudhole. The path climbed through tulip poplars and rhododendron, so thick it blocked the sky. The ground softened as I went higher, from hard clay to damp loam to something that squelched under my boots and steamed faintly in the cool March air. When I reached the cabin, chestnut log, low-roofed, moss on the north side, I noticed 2 things. The first was that the front porch sagged like a tired mouth. The second was that the yard was green, not the gray-green of early March in the mountains, where everything is still deciding whether to commit to spring. Green like May. Green like something underneath was keeping the ground warm. The cabin was small but solid. 1 room, a stone fireplace, a plank floor with gaps you could see the ground through, a rope bed, a cook stove with a cracked firebox, a table made from a single poplar slab, and maps. The walls were covered in maps, hand-drawn, on butcher paper, and the backs of feed sacks and 1 long sheet of drafting paper that must have cost Asa a week's trade. They showed the hollow in cross-section, the surface, the clay layer, the rock beneath, and below that, drawn in red pencil with arrows showing direction of flow, a network of underground springs. Each spring had a temperature written beside it in Asa's careful hand. 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 61 degrees Fahrenheit. The warmest one, at the center of the hollow near the sinkhole, was marked 67 degrees Fahrenheit and circled 3 times. Beside it, Asa had written, "This one never stops. Not in January. Not in any January. This is the heart." Asa Pennington was my mother's uncle, a man I never met alive. He'd come to Madison County in 1898 after being discharged from a railroad crew in Tennessee for what his foreman called an unwillingness to follow direction, and what Asa called a refusal to lay track through a Cherokee burial ground. He bought the hollow for $11 because nobody else wanted it. The land flooded every spring, the soil was boggy, and the locals said it stank of sulfur in July. Asa didn't mind. Asa was interested in the warm mud. He'd noticed that the sinkhole at the center of the property never froze, not even in the coldest winters. Ferns grew around its edges in January. Salamanders lived in the runoff channels year-round. He started measuring temperatures in 1901, driving sharpened sticks into the ground at grid points across the property, and checking them with a mercury thermometer he'd bought from a catalog. He recorded every reading in a series of ledger books he kept on a shelf above the cook stove. 27 years of temperature data. 27 years of proof that the ground in this hollow stayed warm when every other piece of land in Madison County froze solid. The town called him the Mud Man. Children dared each other to run past his gate. The general store owner in Marshall, a man named Virgil Hess, told people Asa was soft in the head from breathing swamp gas. But Asa's ledgers told a different story. The warm springs beneath the hollow were fed by deep geothermal water. Not hot enough to boil, not dramatic enough to be called a hot spring, but warm enough to keep the soil temperature above 45 degrees, even in the dead of winter. Asa had started growing things in the warm zones. Winter lettuce, kale, root vegetables that should have died in November but didn't. He'd built crude cold frames over the warmest spots and grown salad greens in January. He'd planted ginseng along the spring channels where the moisture and warmth were ideal. His last ledger entry, dated December 8, 1934, 3 months before he died of a stroke in his sleep, read, "Pulled turnips from the south bed. Ground temperature 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Air temperature 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The springs don't care about the weather. Neither do the turnips." The first winter hit me like a fist. I thought I was prepared because I'd read about cold. Reading about cold and living in a cabin with gaps in the floor and a cracked firebox are not the same education. By late November, the firewood I'd gathered, green wood, badly split, stacked wrong, burned fast and smoky and gave off half the heat it should have. The creek froze. The path down to the road became a sheet of ice. I ate what I'd stored, dried beans, cornmeal, a sack of potatoes that was already half sprouted when I bought it with the $9 I'd saved from doing laundry at Laurel Creek. By December, I was rationing. By January, I was hungry in a way that isn't just physical. It's a sound, a constant low hum in your chest that tells you the math isn't working, that there isn't enough, that spring is too far away. On the night of January 17th, 1936, I lay in the rope bed with my coat over the blanket and my boots on, and my breath hanging in the air like a question. And I thought, I could walk to Marshall in the morning. I could find a family that needs a hired girl. I could eat someone else's food and sleep in someone else's house and never have to wonder if the firewood will last. I thought about Mrs. Husk and the way she'd nod and say she'd known all along. Then I looked at Asa's maps on the wall, the red lines, the temperatures, the circle around 67 degrees Fahrenheit. I got out of bed, lit the lantern, and walked to the sinkhole in the dark. The air outside was 12 degrees. My breath cracked. But when I knelt at the edge of the sinkhole and put my hand flat on the mud, it was warm, not hot. Warm, like a living thing breathing underneath. I dug my fingers in. The mud was soft, workable, alive. Around the edges, the ferns that shouldn't have been there were green as July. I sat back on my heels in the frozen dark, and I understood what Asa had been mapping for 27 years. The springs weren't just warm water. They were a system, a heating system built by the earth itself, running underneath this hollow like blood through a body, keeping everything above it alive while the rest of the county froze. I went back to the cabin and opened the ledger to January and read every entry for every January going back to 1901. Not once had the sinkhole bed dropped below 45 degrees. Not once. Asa had known. He'd known for decades. He just couldn't get anyone to listen. Opal Creech came up the hollow on a morning in late February, when the ice was still on the rhododendrons, and the path was more memory than trail. She was 74 years old. Silver hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked like it hurt. And she walked with a hickory cane she'd carved herself from a branch that had the natural bend of a question mark. She was a midwife and herb gatherer. 50 years of delivering babies and dosing fevers with bone-set tea and pokeweed poultice. She'd known Asa. She was the only person in the county who'd bought his winter greens without making a joke about the mud man. Her first words to me were, "You look like you've been arguing with this hollow, and the hollow is winning. Let me show you how Asa argued with it, because Asa won." She set her cane against the porch rail and didn't wait for an invitation. Opal knew things the ledgers didn't record. She knew which spring channels stayed warmest longest and which ones cooled by March. She knew that the south side of the sinkhole had the best drainage, and the north side held too much water for anything but watercress. She knew that Asa had planted ginseng along the upper spring channel in 1919, and that those roots, now 16 years old, were worth more per pound than anything else growing in Madison County. She showed me how to read the mud and the way Harlan in the Ozarks might have read limestone. By temperature, by texture, by what was already growing there, without permission. The ferns tell you where the heat is, she said. The salamanders tell you where the water is clean. And the smell, that sulfur smell everyone in Marshall complains about, that tells you the springs are deep. Deep springs don't quit. Shallow springs freeze. You want the ones that smell. Together, we mapped the growing zones. I took Asa's grid system and expanded it, driving stakes every 6 feet across the hollow, measuring ground temperature at dawn and dusk for 3 weeks straight. Opal told me which herbs needed which temperature range. Ginseng wanted the 50s, cool but not cold, moist but not wet. Winter lettuce and kale could handle the mid-40s if they had the cold frames Asa had started building. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, beets, carrots, could go anywhere the ground stayed above 40. The warmest zones, the ones closest to the sinkhole where the temperature hit the mid-60s, could grow things that had no business surviving a Carolina mountain winter. Overwintering onions, garlic planted in October that would be ready by May. Even early potatoes started in February under glass. I dug out the sinkhole bed in March. 3 feet down, I hit a layer of gravel saturated with warm water, not flowing fast, but seeping upward at a constant rate, like the earth slowly exhaling. The water was 64 degrees Fahrenheit. I cupped it in my hands. It smelled of iron and old stone. I sat on the edge of the bed with my boots in the warm mud, and I laughed. Not a polite laugh, a laugh that sounded like a woman who'd eaten rationed cornmeal for 2 months and had just found out the ground itself was a furnace. I said, "Asa, you stubborn old man. You were right the whole time." Opal was standing behind me with her hickory cane. She said, "He knew. He just couldn't build fast enough. That's what you're for." If this story is reaching something in you, subscribe to Hollow and Harvest. Because what I found when I dug past the mud is only the beginning. That warm ground had more to give than 27 years of ledgers could measure, and the valley was about to need every degree of it. I built the beds that spring and summer. Opal directed. I dug. The system was simple once you understood it. The warm springs kept the deep soil above freezing, so anything planted in the warm zones had a growing season that never ended. The challenge was managing the water. Too much, and the roots rotted. Too little, and you lost the heat. I built raised beds with gravel bottoms so the warm spring water could seep up through the gravel, warm the soil from below, and drain away before it waterlogged the roots. I used poplar planks for the frames because poplar was cheap, and Asa had left a stack of them behind the cabin already cut to length, as if he'd known someone would finish the job. For the cold-sensitive crops, the onions, the early potatoes, the garlic, I built cold frames from old window sashes I salvaged from a collapsed schoolhouse down the road. The glass trapped the warmth rising from the spring-heated soil and created pockets of air that stayed 20 degrees warmer than the surrounding atmosphere. On a January morning, when the air outside was 15 degrees, the inside of those cold frames was in the 50s. Lettuce grew, kale grew, spinach grew so fast I had to thin it every 2 weeks. The ginseng was Asa's greatest gift. The roots he'd planted in 1919 had been growing undisturbed for 17 years. Wild simulated ginseng, planted in a natural setting and left to grow without cultivation, was worth 3 times what cultivated ginseng brought because the roots developed the knots and character marks that buyers in the Asian market prized. Opal knew a buyer in Asheville. The first roots I dug that fall, carefully, with a flat-bladed tool Opal showed me how to use so I wouldn't damage the lateral roots, weighed 3 pounds collectively and sold for $47. $47 in 1936 was more money than I'd seen in my entire life. I sat in the cabin that night with the bills on the table and counted them 4 times. Then I bought lumber. Then I built more beds. Then I planted more ginseng along every warm spring channel on the property, spacing them the way Asa's notes specified, 18 inches apart, on north-facing slopes with 70% canopy cover. By September of 1936, I had 14 raised beds in the warm zones, 3 cold frames over the sinkhole area, 200 linear feet of ginseng along the spring channels, and a root cellar I dug into the hillside where the ground temperature was a constant 53 degrees. I had stored potatoes, turnips, parsnips, beets, dried herbs, and 3 jars of ginseng tea that Opal had taught me to brew. I had food for the winter. I had food beyond the winter. The surplus sat in the root cellar like a promise, and for the first time in my life, the math worked. There was enough. People noticed the way they always notice in small mountain communities, not by asking, but by watching. They watched me carry produce into Marshall in a wheelbarrow. They watched me trade winter lettuce for flour in October when nobody else had lettuce. They watched me sell ginseng to Opal's buyer, while their own ginseng patches, the wild ones they poached from national forest land, produced less every year. A woman named Bertie Sams, who kept a boarding house on the Marshall Road, asked if I had turnips to sell. I gave her a bushel for free. She looked at the turnips the way Vernon's mother looked at the potatoes in the last story, like I'd handed her something that shouldn't exist. "These are fresh," she said. "It's November." I said, "The ground doesn't know that." The frost came on October 9th, 1937. Not the regular frost that mountain people expect by late October and prepare for by early November. This was different. This was a killing frost that arrived 3 weeks early, dropped temperatures to 19 degrees in a single night, and destroyed every unharvested crop in Madison County. Corn still on the stalk froze solid. Bean fields turned black by morning. Apple orchards that hadn't been picked lost everything. Tomato gardens, the late ones, the ones people were still canning from, turned to mush in their cages. The frost wasn't just cold, it was sudden. People went to bed on October 8th, expecting 3 more weeks of growing season. They woke up on October 9th to a county that had lost 40% of its food supply in a single night. But in my hollow, the ground was still warm. The cold frames fogged with condensation as the spring heat met the frozen air, and inside them, the lettuce stood upright and green as if October 9th were any other day. The raised beds in the warm zones hadn't even noticed. The turnips were fine. The beets were fine. The parsnips were fine. The ginseng, deep-rooted and insulated by forest canopy and spring warmth, didn't lose a single plant. The sinkhole bed was steaming in the dawn light, a column of warm mist rising from the earth like the hollow was breathing. And around its edges, the ferns were still green, while every other plant in the county was dead or dying. They came the following week, not 41 people like in the Ozark story. More. The frost had broken something in the county's pride. The assumption that you could always count on the growing season, that nature would give you enough time. Families came up the hollow in wagons and on foot. Irene came. My cousin Irene, who had whispered, "A mud hole and some roots," loud enough for the whole clerk's office to hear, drove up the path in her husband's truck with her 2 daughters in the back seat and her jaw set in a way that told me she'd rather be anywhere else. She stood at the edge of the sinkhole bed and stared at the steam rising from the soil and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "How?" I told her. I showed her Asa's maps. I showed her the temperature logs. I showed her the springs and the gravel beds and the cold frames. I gave her turnips and beets and a flat of winter lettuce, and I didn't say a single word about the Mudhole. I didn't have to. The mud was speaking for itself. It was warm and alive and producing food in a county where nothing else was growing. And Irene's face as she loaded the truck told me everything I needed to hear. Opal watched from the porch with her hickory cane across her knees and said, "You didn't make her apologize." I said, "The turnips don't need an apology. They just need someone to eat them." Opal said, "That's what Asa would have said." I said, "I know. If you're watching this Hollow and Harvest story, and you know what it feels like to have someone call your inheritance worthless, hit the like button. It's free, and it helps these stories reach people who need them." Irene came back in November. Alone this time. She walked up the path slowly, the way people walk when they're carrying something heavy that isn't in their hands. She stood at the porch and said, "I shouldn't have said what I said at the reading about the Mudhole." I was stringing dried herbs from the porch rafters. I said, "I know." She said, "I didn't understand what he'd left you." I said, "Neither did I. Not at first." She stood there for a while, looking at the steam rising from the sinkhole in the cold air. Then she said, "Can you teach me?" I said, "Asa left enough maps for anyone who wants to learn." She nodded and walked back down the path. And the next week she came back with a notebook. Forgiveness isn't a single moment. It's a season. It starts when you stop keeping count of what someone owes you and start teaching them what you know. The debt doesn't disappear. You just stop weighing it. A man came in the spring of 1938. Callum Rhett, a stonemason from Burnsville, who'd heard about the warm hollow from a seed buyer in Asheville. He said he wanted to understand geothermal growing. He stayed to build stone retaining walls along the spring channels that lasted 70 years. He had hands that could split rock along its natural grain and eyes that measured angles without a level. He built a stone-lined irrigation channel from the upper spring to the lower beds that used gravity and the natural slope of the hollow to distribute warm water evenly across all 14 beds. It was the most elegant piece of engineering I'd ever seen. And he built it in 6 weeks without a blueprint. He said, "The stone tells you where it wants to go. You just have to listen." We married in June of 1938 on the flat rock beside the upper spring, with Opal as witness and the warm mud as the only church we needed. The decades layered like the sediment in the hollow. The frost of '37 wasn't the last. Killing frosts came again in 1940, 1944, and 1951. And each time the warm hollow produced, while the county around it didn't. Opal trained me in medicinal herbs, and I trained others. By 1945, there were 6 families in Madison County using Asa's warm spring growing method on parcels of land they'd previously written off as swamp or bog. The county extension agent, a young man fresh from NC State who'd never seen geothermal agriculture, came to the hollow, measured the spring temperatures, tested the soil, and wrote a report that was published in the North Carolina Agricultural Review under the title Geothermal Microclimate Cultivation in Western North Carolina. He credited Asa. I stood over his shoulder while he typed the acknowledgement section and made sure he spelled Pennington correctly. Opal died in the autumn of 1949. She was 88, and her hickory cane had worn smooth as glass from 40 years of use. She asked to be buried at the edge of the sinkhole bed, where the ground never froze and the ferns stayed green year-round. "I want to be warm," she said. "I've been cold enough." Callum and I dug the grave ourselves. The soil was soft and dark and 58 degrees 4 feet down. We planted ginseng on her grave because she'd spent her whole life growing things that healed people. And ginseng seemed like the right continuation of the argument she'd been making since before I was born. That the earth gives you what you need if you pay attention to what it's already doing. The University of North Carolina sent a geology team in 1954 to map the spring system. They confirmed what Asa had known since 1901. The springs were fed by deep fractures in the granite bedrock that allowed geothermally heated water to rise to the surface at a constant rate. The lead geologist called it a minor thermal anomaly of no commercial significance. I showed him the 14 beds, the 3 cold frames, the 200 feet of ginseng, the root cellar, and the 40 families that the hollow fed during the frost of '51. And I said, "You might want to reconsider what counts as significant." He revised his report. I have a copy in Asa's ledger between the temperature readings for March 1922 and April 1922. Callum built until his hands gave out. Then he taught. He died in 1973, in the cabin, in the rope bed that I'd replaced twice and he'd reinforced with joints that didn't creak. I buried him next to Opal, in the warm ground. My daughter, our daughter, born in 1940, raised in mud and ginseng and the smell of warm sulfur, took over the beds. Her daughter Alma learned the ledgers. The maps are still on the cabin wall. The temperatures haven't changed. I've been thinking about mud, about how it's the thing people wipe off their boots and scrape off their trucks and apologize for tracking into clean houses. Mud is what you get when water meets earth. When something flowing encounters something solid, and they make a new thing together that is neither liquid nor ground, but something in between. Something alive. Something warm. Asa spent 27 years measuring mud, and people called him crazy. Opal spent 50 years gathering herbs from muddy hillsides, and people called her a witch. I spent 56 years growing food in a hollow that everyone said was worthless, and the food didn't care what they called me. It just grew. The mud didn't need anyone's permission. It didn't need a deed or a clerk's office or a cousin in an expensive hat. It just stayed warm and let things live. If you've ever been handed something the world said was useless, a piece of land, a strange talent, a way of seeing that nobody else shares, hold on to it. Get your hands in it. Don't listen to the room that's laughing. Listen to the ground. The ground doesn't laugh. The ground just tells you its temperature, and if you write it down long enough, the way Asa did, you'll find the pattern. And the pattern is always the same. The things that save us are the ones that were under our feet the whole time, too humble to announce themselves, too warm to freeze, too stubborn to stop. Thank you for watching this Hollow and Harvest story. If my life reminded you that the things other people call a mudhole might be the most valuable ground you'll ever stand on, please share it. Subscribe to Hollow and Harvest for more stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary things in the places the world passed by. And tell me in the comments, what's the thing under your feet that nobody else sees the value in?